So I made a video about race in America. It kind of went viral, and people asked a lot of follow-up questions. I want to mention 4 questions that have come up a lot, and also talk about one more topic that is really interesting. So what are the 4 questions? Number 1, what about the black family? Too many black families have no fathers. Why didn't you talk about that? Number 2, what about the welfare state, the war on poverty? Didn't the welfare programs of the 1960s do serious damage to black communities? Number 3, why do you say we did this? I didn't do any of this stuff. And number 4, beyond caring, what can we actually do? Okay, let's jump in. So what about the state of black families? Isn't that a big part of the problem? Well, let's take a look. In 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan prepared a report for President Johnson on the Negro family as part of Johnson's war on poverty. That report included the stunning statistic that 25% of babies born to African American mothers were born outside of marriage, were non-marital births. 25%. At that time, the rate of non-marital births for white American mothers was less than 5%. Moynihan believed that there was a crisis in black families that required intervention on a national scale. If black men couldn't find meaningful work that could support families, black marriages and 2-parent households would continue to decline. Non-marital births would continue at this shockingly high rate of 25% or more, and poverty would remain a large-scale problem. The report declared that black communities were suffering from a tangle of pathologies that were impeding progress. The Moynihan report was not well received. To many, it sounded like Moynihan was blaming the victim. Martin Luther King, at that time working for the passage of the Voting Rights Act, expressed fears that the problems described in the report would be attributed to innate Negro weakness and used by racists to justify opposition to voting rights. The Moynihan report was kicked under the table. Since 1965, we've discovered a couple of things. First, we've learned that healthy families are even more important than we thought. Or, as the Washington Post declared 21 years later in 1986, Moynihan was right. Intact families with 2 involved parents are hugely beneficial to kids. The collapse of marriage is, in fact, a really big deal. But second, we've discovered that the decline of marriage is not a uniquely black problem. Traditional 2-parent families are not in crisis only in black communities. They're in crisis everywhere. Today, the non-marital birth rate for white Americans has passed 30%. That's higher than the rate for African Americans that shocked America in 1965. And what is the non-marital birth rate for African Americans today? A staggering 70%. But let's back up and unpack the figure for white Americans and see what we learn. According to data from the CDC, the non-marital birth rate for white women with college degrees is less than 5%, exactly where it was for all white women way back in 1965. Now, take away the college degree, and the non-marital birth rate for white women with only a high school diploma jumps up to 40%. Take away the high school diploma, and the non-marital birth rate for white women without a high school diploma is 65%, virtually matching the crazy high non-marital birth rate for African American women. So what do we learn from this? Upper class and upper middle class Americans still value marriage, regardless of race. It is in the working class, especially the working poor, where the institution of marriage is collapsing. But why are the overall numbers so much worse in African American communities? Because African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be living in poverty than white Americans. And the non-marital birth rate among African Americans was already 16 points higher than among white Americans way back in 1940. So African American communities started at a much higher rate. Since 1965, the non-marital birth rate has actually been growing at a faster rate among white Americans than among black Americans. Marriage isn't collapsing in black America, it's collapsing in working class America. Now, why marriage is in crisis among the working class is a tricky issue, but think about it this way. You're a working class boy growing up in a working class neighborhood. You see your dad go to the steel mill or the car factory or the coal mine every day and come home with a paycheck to take care of his family. You assume you will grow up to do the same. Then the steel mill closes, the car factory moves overseas, the coal mine shutters. How can you do what your father did? How can you take care of a family? That's what you've seen men do do your whole life. That, as far as you can tell, is what it means to be a man. And you can't do it. And the whole pattern, school, job, marriage, children, breaks. Whether you're African American on the south side of Chicago or working class white in Ohio or West Virginia, what you've always assumed you would do, grow up to be a man like your father, is suddenly undoable. You lose hope. And if this repeats for another generation or two, pretty soon there are little boys growing up in these communities with zero memory of a time when men went to work with their hands and came home and built families. The chain is broken. The institutional knowledge of marriage and family is lost. This is an incredibly hard problem to address, and today it is becoming as big an issue in working-class white communities as it has been for several generations in working-class black communities. Without the hope of being able to support a family, men give up on the idea of fatherhood, and families collapse. When the Moynihan Report was issued in 1965, just as Dr. King feared, many Americans took it as a sign that African Americans were somehow morally inferior, irresponsible. They've abandoned God's design for families, we said, and now they're suffering the consequences. Was there something unique about African American morality that created the breakdown of families? Interestingly, there's another ethnic group in America that matches African Americans on almost every metric. Unemployment for this group is even higher. Non-marital births are nearly as high. Single-parent homes nearly as high. What ethnic group is it? Native Americans. Think about it. These are the only two groups of people that weren't given a choice whether or not to live in white America. The only two groups that have been actively and consistently treated unjustly by European settlers since before there even was an America. And today they are the two groups whose communities are marked the most by poverty, unemployment, and addiction. Is it just a coincidence that we see the most dramatic breakdown of family structure in the two communities that have faced the most historic injustice? The other reason I didn't bring up family structure in my video on race is because on the surface it seems like an easy fix. Simple. If you don't want to be poor, get married. Do things in the right order. And there is truth in that. But what's killing families in working-class America, including white working-class America, isn't unwillingness to do things in the right order. It's hopelessness. Yes, two-parent families are much better for kids. The data on that is clear. But the root of the problem isn't irresponsibility. The root of the problem is that we have millions of men who do not believe they can do what their fathers and grandfathers did. Go to work, bring home a paycheck, support a family. The root of the problem isn't a loss of responsibility. It's a loss of hope. Children need dads, and dads need to believe they live in a society where it is possible for them to succeed. Moynihan's phrase, "a tangle of pathologies," is the most quoted line from his report on the black family. But he said something else that has been largely forgotten, something as true for Native Americans as it is for African Americans. 3 centuries of injustice have brought about deep-seated structural distortions in the life of the Negro American. The cycle can be broken only if these distortions are set right. 3 centuries of injustice have brought about deep-seated distortions that need to be set right. It's tempting to say, just get married and everything will be better. But undoing the impact of 3 centuries of injustice that was enforced by violence, is way more complicated than that. We need to resist overly simplistic solutions to very complicated problems. Second question, isn't the welfare state responsible for the mess we have today? I've had people point to the welfare policies of the 1960s, President Johnson's war on poverty, and say, that's why African Americans are poor. Or, that's why African Americans are unemployed. Or, that's why African American families fell apart. If the government hadn't tried to help, they'd be doing much better. Today, we sometimes use this to argue against any additional government intervention on behalf of black communities, because we tried it in the 60s and it only made things worse. So is it true? Did the war on poverty make things worse? Let's take those questions one at a time. The first one is easy. Did the welfare programs of the 1960s increase black poverty? Well, in 1959, the poverty rate for black Americans was 55%. More than half of all African Americans lived below the poverty line. By the end of the 1960s, after the implementation of Johnson's policies, the poverty rate for African Americans had dropped to 32%, almost by half. Now, that's not necessarily because of Johnson's policies. The 1960s was a decade of growth in American manufacturing and a period where many black Americans moved from low-paying agricultural jobs in the South to higher-paying factory jobs in the North. So the reduction in poverty isn't necessarily a result of the new policies, but the argument that the war on poverty increased poverty is plainly false. Did the war on poverty increase black unemployment? Well, that's really hard to say one way or another, since we didn't start keeping track of black unemployment until 1972, after the policies were in place. But since 1972, black unemployment has tracked fairly tightly with white unemployment, just typically twice as high. When white unemployment goes down because the economy is growing, so does black unemployment, and vice versa, with the exception that recessions that affect white Americans generally affect black Americans much more. But there is no evidence in unemployment data that the welfare policies of the 1960s are responsible for higher black unemployment today. So what about family breakdown? Well, this one is trickier. Americans have always been rugged individualists. We've always believed that any able-bodied man should be able to provide for a family, and we tend to look down on men who can't. Because of this belief that men should be able to provide, most of the welfare policies of the 1960s were written with a no man in the house clause, meaning if a benefit was offered to a poor family, the family was immediately disqualified if there was an able-bodied man living in the household. The problem was that even though many black fathers were able-bodied, many were also poorly educated. And as unskilled manufacturing jobs began disappearing to the suburbs or overseas or to automation, there simply weren't enough jobs left that could allow an unskilled laborer to support a family. So if a black father was unable to find work that could support his family, the only way his wife and kids could receive assistance, surplus government cheese and peanut butter, for example, was if he literally walked out the door and abandoned them. This would be an example of unintended consequences, and yes, it probably did have an impact on the increase in single-parent households in working-class communities. But remember, the high non-marital birth rate that shocked America in 1965 was recorded before Johnson's welfare policies had gone into effect. Did the welfare programs of the 1960s have some unintended consequences that affected black families? Yes. Did they create the situation we find in black communities today? No. Most of the trends we see today were established before the war on poverty. The notion that inner-city African American communities were doing just fine until the government came along and messed everything up is entirely false. We forget sometimes that when Johnson launched the war on poverty, the majority of impoverished Americans were white. The majority of the money spent on benefits to the poor went to white families, typically rural white families. And yet today, when we think of welfare, we think almost exclusively of black families in urban America. Why is that? This is the interesting part I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Researcher Martin Gillens asked this question and came up with an ingenious way to look for an answer. He studied 40 years of back issues of the three major news magazines, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report. He cataloged every article about poverty in America across 40 years of issues and noted the race of the families in the photos accompanying each article. When America talked about poverty, what color were the families they were picturing? The results were striking. Before 1960, more than 80% of the photos accompanying stories about poverty were of rural white families. America's poor, at least as the media represented them, were mostly white and rural. Even in 1964, the year President Johnson announced the war on poverty, roughly 75% of the accompanying photos were of rural white families. Then something happened. The very next year, in 1965, pictures of poverty in America were suddenly 50% black. 2 years later, in 1967, photos of poor Americans in the three major news weeklies were 70% black. So what made the change? Was there a sudden explosion of black poverty? Not at all. In 1960, around 25% of America's poor were African American. In 1967, the figure was slightly higher, but still under 30%. So there weren't more poor black Americans. Instead, what had changed was a new focus by civil rights leaders on economic justice, with a burst of news stories accompanied by pictures of impoverished black Americans, and a focus on the state of inner cities brought about by an explosion of protest marches and riots. The news about poverty had swung in just 3 short years from being predominantly about rural whites to predominantly about urban blacks. The tone of the articles was also changing. In 1964, the national impression of Johnson's war on poverty was generally positive. We were the richest nation on earth. Why should children be starving? But a year later, there was a burst of journalism about mismanagement of funds and programs and an increase in stories about welfare fraud. At the same time attitudes toward welfare were growing more negative, the accompanying photos were growing more black. Politicians noticed changing attitudes toward welfare programs and jumped in. During his 1976 run for president, Ronald Reagan repeatedly told stories of the welfare queen, a Chicago woman who had cheated the government out of hundreds of thousands of dollars by filing welfare claims under false names. Campaigning on a platform critical of social programs, the welfare queen became a frequent theme of Reagan campaign events and radio addresses. Even today, the term welfare queen brings to mind an African-American woman sitting home, having babies, and collecting checks. The true story of the woman Reagan was describing is a little different. The Chicago welfare queen was a woman named Linda Taylor, though no one knows if that was her real name since she used more than 30 aliases. In addition to defrauding the government through various elaborate welfare schemes, Linda Taylor is also believed to have stolen babies from hospitals to sell them and is suspected of having murdered at least 2 female acquaintances. So, far from a lazy grifter, Linda Taylor was actually a very sophisticated and very dangerous criminal. Oh, and according to the 1930 census records, she was white. Back to Martin Gillen's research. From 1970 through 1990, black Americans continued to make up roughly 60% of representations of poverty in the media, even though they seldom made up more than 30% of America's poor. There were exceptions, though, as in 1982 and 1983, when pictures of white families suddenly spiked all the way up to 70%. What happened in 82 and 83? The worst recession in a generation, combined with threatened cutbacks to social programs by the Reagan administration. Suddenly, middle-class families were falling into poverty with less of a safety net to help them. And who did editors choose to feature in photos to generate sympathy for these newly poor families? White families. As soon as the recession ended, journalistic focus returned to stories of wasteful spending and portrayals of poor urban black families. Poverty in America went back to being black. Why does this matter? Because poverty in America isn't a uniquely black problem. To this day, African American families make up less than 30% of America's poor and receive only about a third of government spending on poverty programs. 70% of our spending goes to white and Latino families. Yet when we think about helping the poor, we think of handouts to African American mothers with multiple kids and no husbands living in the inner city. Why? Because those are the images we've been shown over and over. And here's the sad reality of lingering racism in America. The more we think of poverty as a black problem, the less we want to help. It isn't us, after all, it's them. And very old tropes about African Americans being lazy and irresponsible, remember the vagrancy laws, rear their ugly heads to make us less compassionate about America's poor. And as Christians, called time and time again in Scripture to care for the poor, this is nothing less than tragic. Third question, and this one's short. Why do you say we did these things? I didn't do any of these things. I didn't own slaves or redline neighborhoods or push for mass incarceration. So what's with the we? We defeated Hitler. We put a man on the moon. We won the Cold War. We horribly mistreated Native Americans for centuries. Hey, wait, I didn't do that one. You didn't do any of those things. We love to take collective ownership for the great things America has done and then completely reject any ownership of the terrible things America has done. The Bible talks about individual sin and individual repentance. As highly individualistic Westerners, we like that. We get it. It makes sense. But the Bible also talks about societal sin and societal repentance. Multiple times in the Old Testament, we see all of Israel, the people of God, called to repent for sins they did not all commit. In Daniel 9, we see Daniel repenting for the sins of his forefathers, sins he did not commit. In Nehemiah 1, we see Nehemiah doing the exact same thing. We don't like the idea of taking responsibility for sins we did not personally commit. It isn't very American, but it is very biblical. But you're making America sound like a terrible place. No, America is good and bad, virtuous and sinful, selfless and selfish. Why? Because America is us, and we are all those things. I am all those things. Let's own the problem together. That's how America has always accomplished big things. And finally, many people have asked, okay, this situation is depressing. I care. So what can I do? And the problem, the after effects of 400 years of racism, does seem too big to solve. But many things have been tried, and we know some of them work. For example, preschool. We know that access to free preschool has a dramatically positive effect on low-income children. Any effort to provide preschool to disadvantaged communities should be supported by all of us. It works. And that leads directly to education funding. When whites fled cities to the suburbs, we took our property taxes with us. We clustered into high-income mini-communities and funded extraordinary schools for our own kids, leaving chronically underfunded schools behind for minority kids. There have been many efforts at local, state, and national levels to try to balance funding between wealthy and poor school districts. We should support those efforts, even if they make our extraordinary schools ever so slightly less extraordinary. We need to support efforts to train more African American teachers. We mentioned in the last video that due to unconscious bias, gifted black students are half as likely to be recommended for gifted programs if their teacher is white. The presence of even one black teacher during the school years of a black student has a demonstrably positive impact on that student's educational outcome. Why are there so few black teachers? Because when schools were integrated in the 1950s and 60s, students were integrated, but teachers were not. Because many white parents refused to allow their children to be taught by black teachers, thousands of black teachers lost their jobs. The ranks of black teachers in America were decimated and have never fully recovered. We need to change that. We also need to support efforts to provide mentors and role models to low-income kids. We need to encourage, not penalize, marriage. And finally, there are little things that we can all do. In the Old Testament, Nehemiah was able to get Jerusalem's wall rebuilt because he was in a position where he could use his influence to make a difference. Some of us are in positions or have resources that allow us to make a difference too, not as saviors, but as allies. For example, my mother is a retired college professor. Our lives fell apart when I was 9 and my parents split up. For several years, we ended up living below the poverty line. But we had a house, and she was able to use that equity to move us to a suburb of Chicago with great schools and ample opportunity. Our house funded our second chance. Realizing how much home ownership had helped us, she recently wrote a check from her retirement fund that gave an underprivileged family in one of Chicago's poorest neighborhoods the down payment towards their first house. Our church was so inspired by that idea that they're setting up a program partnering with an inner city ministry to do the same thing on a larger scale. Not saviors, allies. A home, an education, an opportunity changes the course of a family. Change the course of enough families, and you can change the course of a community. One last thing. Some Christian friends have said, but what about the Bible? What about the gospel? Don't African American communities need to hear about Jesus? As a Christian, I believe we all need the Bible. We all need the gospel. But to propose that perhaps black Americans aren't doing well because of a lack of Christian influence, well, we need to look at the data. Black Americans are more likely to believe in God than white Americans, more likely to say faith is very important, more likely to read the Bible, more likely to pray every day. Black Americans are more likely to have biblically sound theology than white Americans, and are more likely to look to the Bible as their primary source of ethics. In other words, if we're looking for the most devoutly Christian group in America, that group isn't white. So let's summarize. families are in trouble, not just in Black America, in all of America, especially among the working class. This is an extraordinarily difficult problem to address, but there are churches and ministries trying to do just that, and we need to support them. The welfare programs of the 1960s had some unintended consequences, but they did not create the problems we see today. Let's not use that as an excuse to not help. I say we did this because those of us in the majority have been in the majority since the very beginning. The policies that created inequality came from the majority, and any big changes needed to address that inequality will need the support of the majority. That's us. And finally, you can do things to help. Big things, little things. The impact of historic racism still echoes in America, harming millions of lives. It is a problem. Let's make it our problem, and let's do something about it.